Welcome, everyone. My name is Ahmed. I am Palestinian from Gaza. I'd like to welcome you all to this event today titled Zionism, Anti-Semitism, and Palestine, the history of the Zionist ideology's attempts to erase the Palestinian identity. This national webinar is hosted by Palestine Justice Movement Sydney and in collaboration with Free Palestine Melbourne, and is also endorsed by many other organizations across this continent, including APAN, AFOPA, FOPWA, and TPAN. I have today the pleasure of being in conversation with Tony Greenstein. But before I introduce Tony, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land from which we're all dialing in from today, and pay my respect to their elders past, present, and emerging. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. We are dialing in from a ground zero of a genocide that occurred more than 200 years ago, and its echoes still reverberate to our day. I am dialing in from Camaragal country. I'm dialing in from a land that was once declared terra nullius, a statement that rendered the Aboriginal people of this land non-existent, non-human, signaling the start of genocidal campaigns to dehumanize and exterminate the original owners of this land. A similar statement was made about Palestine, and similar actions also ensued in the land of Palestine, namely a land without people for a people without land, a statement that was made as early as 1843, to quote Tony's book, by a Christian restorationist. Zionism was referred to as restorationism until the 1880s, when the term Zionism was first coined by the Jewish Zionists in Austria. Just examining that second part of this statement, for a people without land, this, maliciously and openly claims that the Jewish people across the world do not belong to countries where they live in. It just suggests that an Italian Jew whose parents, grandparents, their grandparents lived in Italy for decades and decades and hundreds of years, they don't belong to Italy. Same goes for France, for Poland, for Russian Jews. Doesn't that strike you as an anti-Semitic? I mean, the fact that the Zionist movement agreed on, adopted, encouraged, and empowered many of anti-Semitic tropes and anti-Semites is not controversial and is very well documented through historical archives. And this is why we're having this conversation today, to analyze the relationship, or more precisely, the lack of it, between Zionism and anti-Semitism, and their relationship to Palestine and to the attempts to erase the Palestinian identity. And who would be better placed to discuss this with other than Tony Greenstein. Tony is a Jewish staunch anti-Zionist, anti-fascist, long-term activist and author. He is the son of a rabbi and the co-founder of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign UK in 1982. This is how long Tony has been in the leadership of the Palestine Solidarity movement in the UK. He is also the founding member of the Jews for Boycotting Israeli Goods. Tony's recent book, published in 2022, titled Zionism During the Holocaust, The Weaponization of Memory in the Service of State and Nation, is an incredible reference for those who wish to learn about the history, the dark and ugly history, I might add, of Zionism in the early 20th century and during the First and the Second World War. Today, with Tony's help, we'll try to uncover some of this dark history in an attempt to shape our understanding and judgment of what Zionism is. Before we start, I just want to welcome you, Tony to this conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. It's 8 o'clock in Brighton, which is on the south coast of England now. So our world is just getting up, as it were.
Perfect.
Zionism.
Yes, and you're having your coffee now. So
Yeah.
just by way of introducing us to this conversation, Tony, I mean, your book is really rich of just archival facts through history. I just want to emphasize before we start, as we always do, we all understand and internalize the fact that hate and criticism of Judaism as a religion and the Jewish people solely for being Jewish is a form of blatant act of racism and anti-Semitism and is to be unequivocally rejected and combated, just like criticism and inciting hate against Islam and Muslim people and Christianity and Christians for solely being followers of those religions or any other religions for that matter is considered a blatant act of racism and must be rejected and combated at all terms. In the same way that racism against indigenous peoples and people of color, minorities, is a form of racism and must be rejected and combated. I'd like to, before we start, I'd like to cite some of the excerpts from a memorandum issued by the Secretary of State for India in 1917, Edwin Montagu, a member of the Anti-Zionist League of the British Jews, just before the issuance of Balfour Declaration, as he knew that such a letter was about to be issued. In his memorandum to the British government, Montagu described Zionism as a mischievous political creed. He also asserts that there is not a Jewish nation. He goes on to say that the policy, referring to Balfour Declaration of His Majesty's government, is anti-Semitic and in result will prove a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country in the world. There's a last quote of Edwin Montagu. He was quoted to say the sympathy which the president of the local government board suggests is widespread and deep-rooted in the Protestant world, with the idea of restoring the Hebrew people to the land which was to be their inheritance, is, I fear, very often a thinly cloaked desire to get rid of the Jewish ingredient in Protestant population. So Zionism, as Professor Rashid Al-Khalidi in his book 100 Years of War on Palestine, is a late 19th century colonial national movement, adorned itself with biblical code that was powerfully attractive to Bible-reading Protestants in the Great Britain and the United States, blinding them to the modernity of Zionism and to its colonial nature. 2 lines under colonial nature. And so Zionism as a settler colonial ideology was known for what it is within, you know, the absolute majority of the world's Jewish communities, especially in Europe. It's fascinating to read how the early Zionist leadership viewed Zionism as opposed to Judaism. You know, I couldn't help but noticing a quote for Vladimir Jabotinsky in Tony's book. You know, he's one of the Zionist leaders and the founder of revisionist Zionists. He was quoted to say, "I have no doubt that I am a Zionist because the Jewish people is a very nasty people and its neighbors hate it, and they are right." Many similar statements were made by other Zionist leaders in the Zionist movement, like Herzl himself, Ben-Gurion, and so on and so forth. So to that end, Tony, you've written this book, you know, Zionism During the Holocaust. You divided it into 3 sections, you know, pointing out the relationship between Zionism and anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic regimes before, during, and after the Holocaust, the Nazi Holocaust. As I was reading the book, it seems to me that one of the main propositions that you're trying to make is that Zionism confirms the claim that the Jews are foreigners in the countries in which they are at home, which means that the Jews can never assimilate in the societies they live in, due to some sort of deficiency they have or something. And that to me sounds a blatant form of racism. That to me sounds anti-Semitic. I mean, you mentioned in your preface that at early stages of your life, you've discovered that if anti-Semitism was wrong, then so were all forms of racism. But Zionism drew the opposite conclusion. Only anti-Semitism was wrong. Could you expand on that statement and provide some more details into this argument that you're making? How is it that anti-Semitism related to Zionism, and what were the behaviors of the Zionist movement back then? But before you start, Tony, I mean, also tell us about your own journey to where you are now. I mean, I know you're one of the pioneering figures in the anti-Zionist movement in the UK. You've managed to discover the truth about Zionism and about the state of Israel at an early stage. So tell us about your initial thoughts growing up and your reaction to Zionism, and before you dig deeper into your book.
Okay. Well, let me say, I'd like to take it all really as a whole and answer the questions later. I think that's quite important. I don't want to spend much time on my background. I was brought up as an Orthodox Jew in a Zionist family, and my father was a rabbi. And I suppose partly because I became a Marxist, I rejected Zionism because it was particularist and universalist. But let's not dwell on that. Let's look at the issue as a whole. One of the most oft repeated comments about the situation in the Middle East and Zionism is it's very complicated and complex, whereas in fact it is, of course, very simple. Zionism and the project that it fostered was a European settler colonial movement with a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other. And it wasn't that different in many ways from many other settler colonial movements, which also drew inspiration from God. But I think the points to bear in mind is, well, firstly, to simply ask ourselves what Zionism is. And quite simply, it's a movement to create a Jewish state. At first, Herzl wasn't even sure where it was to be, whether it was Argentina or Palestine, but because of the religious connotations and what he thought would be the ability to bring behind him certain religious elements, he plumped for Palestine. But he was a secular Jew, and his first son Hans wasn't even circumcised, so he wore his Judaism very lightly. In fact, one of his first solutions to what was then called the Jewish question was mass conversion to Catholicism. But the first form of Zionism was not Jewish Zionism, it was Christian Zionism, which predated Jewish Zionism by 4 centuries. It was a product of the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and so on, if you like, the growing maturity of European society, and in particular, the Protestant religion, because the Catholics had always taken the point of view that they were the direct descendants of the children of Israel. They quote Matthew 21:43, where speaking to the Jews shortly before his crucifixion, Jesus pronounced, "Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to a people who will produce its fruit." And that people, in the eyes of the Catholic Church, was themselves. The Protestant Reformation with all that that entailed. It was really the religion of capitalism and colonialism, held that it was the Jews in Europe who should return to Palestine, although, of course, they didn't particularly want to. And it has to be said, I mean, the Jews the Jews were far less enthusiastic about Zionism, and so it was to remain right up to the Holocaust itself. Zionism was a distinct minority. The first person to seriously propose a Jewish state was Napoleon in 1799, but he was unable to conquer Palestine and Egypt, and so nothing much came of it. But then British imperialism was different. It was the strongest imperial power, as we know it. A quarter of the globe was red. And the two main figures, if you like, in transmuting religious Zionism to political Zionism, a Christian political Zionism, were Lord Palmerston, who was British Prime Minister, and the reformer, Lord Shaftesbury. And it was at Shaftesbury's insistence that Palmerston in 1838 put into effect the decision to open a British consulate in Jerusalem and appoint a vice consul there, William Young, and his title was Protector of the Jews in Palestine, although at that point they didn't need much protection. And then there was a lead article in the Times of the 17th of August 1840, which called for a plan to, quote, plant the Jewish people in the land of their fathers, claiming such a plan was under serious political consideration. When Palmerston approached the Jewish Board of Deputies in August 1840 to talk about possible Jewish cooperation in a Jewish settlement project, he got a very meager response, because the only ones who didn't want to return were the Jews themselves. And this was not surprising for anyone who knows the history of British Jewry. They were fighting the kind of bourgeois Jewish community who the Board of Deputies represented. They were fighting for Jewish emancipation, the right to vote, the right to stand in Parliament. There was actually a very serious struggle for that. One MP, I can't remember his name, for the City of London was elected 3 times before eventually he was accepted. The House of Commons supported the emancipation, but the House of Lords threw it back. It was only in 1858 the Jews finally got the vote and got the right to stand for Parliament. So the very last thing that they wanted was someone coming along and telling them that they weren't really British, they were part of a separate Jewish nation, for obvious reasons. So Jewish Zionism, which barely existed at that time, except amongst a few intellectuals. Moses Hess was recognized in 1860 as the first political Zionist, but he built nothing around him. British Jews were adamantly opposed to it, and in 1842, the Board of Deputies passed a resolution, the 7th of November, which resolved that it is, quote, precluded from originating any measure for carrying out the benevolent views of Colonel Churchill respecting the Jews of Syria. And likewise, the 1845 Frankfurt Rabbinical Conference renounced the restoration idea completely, voting that, quote, all petitions for the return to the land of our fathers and for the restoration of the Jewish state should be eliminated from the prayers. And there was the Pittsburgh Reform Declaration of 1888, which likewise derided the idea that Jews should return to Palestine. And it was really only Jewish Zionism really only got off the ground as a reaction to the Odessa pogroms of 1881 after the assassination of Tsar Alexander II. And Zionism was one of many Jewish reactions, but it was unique in this sense that it accepted the outlook and the ideas of the anti-Semites themselves. The Jews really were an alien element in non-Jewish political society, which had outstayed their welcome. They were guests in someone else's hotel who hadn't departed when they said they would. And they took the stance that anti-Semitism, because it was based on the Jews being strangers in other people's lands, could not be fought. In the words of Leo Pinsker, who was the founder of Chovevei Zion, the Lovers of Zion, in 1882, in a book or a pamphlet, Auto Emancipation, he asked what is, he called it Judeophobia because he was a doctor. And he said, what is it? It is a mental disease. And as such, it is hereditary. And having been inherited for 2,000 years, it is incurable. And this was the stance of Zionism. If a disease is incurable, why bother to fight it? It's totally pointless. And Herzl was of the same opinion. He wrote in his diaries, in the middle of the Dreyfus affair. The Dreyfus affair was the biggest convulsion in any European country in terms of anti-Semitism. The monarchists, the clerical reactionaries, the military had framed a Jewish captain for treason. This was after the Franco-Prussian War. And they wanted to use this really to deprive French Jews of the emancipation they'd been granted in the French Revolution. And it was a vigorous fight. Émile Zola's, Jacques Hughes, and others took up the cudgels. And it was a fight between modern France and pre-modern France, between feudal and, if you like, modern capitalist France. And the Dreyfusards won, if you like. But Herzl was attracted to the anti-Dreyfusards, a person called Edward Drummond, who was the deputy for Algiers, led the anti-Dreyfusards. And Herzl went out of his way to get a favorable review for his new pamphlet, which came out in 1896, The Jewish State. And Herzl wrote in his diaries, I think it was page 6 or 7. Yes, it was page 6. He wrote, in Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognize the emptiness and futility of trying to combat anti-Semitism. Combat is inverted commas, incidentally. And this was the attitude of Zionism, which differentiated it from every other Jewish current. Like many separatist organizations, it had taken on the colors of their persecutors. And Herzl makes many such statements in his diaries, if you go one page after, because he wrote a voluminous 4-volume diary. He said, anti-Semitism has grown and continues to grow, and so do I. Because Herzl recognized that without anti-Semitism, there would be no Zionism. And others, like, for instance, Jacob Klatskin, who's the co-founder of the Jewish Encyclopedia and editor of the Zionist paper Die Welt from 1909 to 1911, he talks, and I'll go to the quote. Klatskin said, and Klatskin was, if you like, not someone who was shy to put his point of view. He said, if we do not admit the rightfulness of anti-Semitism, we deny the rightfulness of our own nationalism. Instead of establishing societies for defense against the anti-Semites who want to reduce our rights, we should establish societies for defense against our friends who desire to defend our rights, because the Zionists saw emancipation, and with it assimilation, as their deadliest enemy. They wanted to preserve the Jewish people as a fixed political entity. And you could describe Israel today as a kind of racial preservation project.
Exactly. I don't want to cut your line of thought, Tony, but I just want to pick up on one thing. I promise not to interject, but this one, I mean, I want to pick up on Dreyfus affair, because in his speech in response to the ICC ruling recently, Benjamin Netanyahu brought up the Dreyfus affair, saying that his trial or his accusation is similar to Dreyfus affair. To my understanding, Dreyfus was a French Jewish who was implicated as being in an espionage operation for the Germans or the British against the Russians, and because he was Jewish, is that right? And I mean, how is that related to Benjamin Netanyahu's?
It's not related at all. Benjamin Netanyahu is nothing if not a born liar. He also attributed the Holocaust to the Palestinians on the basis of a meeting between Haj Amin al-Husseini. It was at the Zionist Congress of 2016, where he alleged that this was in November 1941 when they met. He alleged that Hitler only wanted to expel the Jews, but the Palestinian Mufti said, well, if you expel them, they'll all come to Palestine, burn them. Now, this was absolute nonsense. Firstly, there was a detailed record kept of the conversation, and this does not appear in the record. Secondly, in any case, the Holocaust had been going on, had started in June with the Operation Barbarossa. And in fact, some 3 days or 4 days later, in December the 4th, the first extermination camp, Chelmno, was set up. In fact, a number of extermination camps were already in the making. But Benjamin Netanyahu does not know how to tell the truth. So there is no connection between him and Dreyfus. Dreyfus was fighting as a French Jew, and those who were fighting for him fought for him as a French Jew. It had nothing to do with the fantasies and fables of Netanyahu. I mean, even within Israel, amongst Zionists, they recognize that Netanyahu has an inability to tell the truth. But if I can go back, you see, one of the foundation stones of Zionism is something called the negation of the diaspora, because Zionism aimed to establish a Jewish state, and it aimed to replace the diaspora, galut, the exile. And in a famous quote, Jabotinsky said, either you wind up the galut or the galut will wind you up. And because of this, they began to see the Jewish diaspora in the same terms and with the same eyes as the anti-Semites. I mentioned Jacob Klatskin, and I'll go to another of his quotes, where he talks about Jews in the diaspora being a people disfigured in both body and soul, in word of a horror. At the very most, it can maintain us in a state of national impurity and breed some sort of outlandish creature. The result will be something neither Jew nor Gentile, in any case, not a pure national type, some sort of oddity amongst the people going by the name of Jew. And anyone who wants to find that quote, apart from in my own book, can go to a very useful book by Arthur Hertzberg, who was also a Zionist, and he's collected it in a book called The Zionist Idea. And in fact, he has a whole series of articles by all the early original Zionists, of which Klatskin is one. But there are many other examples. Pinchas Rosenblatt, who was the first Minister of Justice in Israel, described Palestine as an institute for fumigating Jewish vermin. And Hashoma Hatzair, which was supposed to be on the far left of the Zionist movement, described in The Young Zionist in 1936 the Jew as a caricature of a natural, normal human being, both physically and spiritually. So that was December 1936. And Joachim Doron, who is an Israeli political scientist, he wrote in the Journal of Israeli History, number 8, about this phenomena. And he described how and this is in his article, Classic Zionism and Its Enemies. Say it's in the Journal of Israeli History, which was the Studies in Zionism, described how rather than take up arms against the enemies of the Jews, Zionism attacked the enemy within, the diaspora Jew himself, and subjected him to a hail of criticism. Indeed, the perusal of the Zionist sources reveals a wealth of charges against the diaspora Jew. And I've put in bold, some of which are so scathing that the generation that witnessed Auschwitz has difficulty comprehending them, which is probably why most Zionists will never come across them, because they've actually been all but eradicated from Zionist history. And many Zionists were not only quite happy, but Arthur Rupin, who was probably the second most important person in pre-state Palestine after David Ben-Gurion himself. He was a believer in eugenics and the racial sciences, but was also the director of the Palestine office from 1908 and was responsible for the development of the kibbutzim as collective colonial settlements and much else besides. Reacted when a friend of his called him an anti-Semite. He responded, quote, "I've already established here," that's in his diary, "that I despise the cancers of Judaism more than the worst anti-Semites." And I might add, for those who are listening, in case there are any Zionists, one of the very worst anti-Semitic tropes that anyone can engage in is a belief in the Jewish blood libel, the idea that Jews in the Middle Ages baked their matzah, their unleavened bread, in the blood of Christian children. I mean, I say this was a pretty horrific blood libel and led to many hundreds, if not thousands, of dead. Yet Moses Hess subscribed to it. He was the first Zionist. I won't quote what Shlomo Avineri, who's a pretty famous Zionist writer, wrote about it, but I'll leave it for you. I think it's in my book, though obviously I had to leave certain things out. But that, if you like, was the attitude of the Zionists to anti-Semitism. And I have to say, because one of the myths that we, of course, now suffer from is that Jews always wanted to return to Zionism. They said every day or every week in their prayer book, next year in Jerusalem. But when given the choice, Jews did not want to go to Palestine. This was a spiritual prayer, a spiritual longing. It had no political impact. I mean, Jews did go to Palestine for 4 centuries when the Ottomans took over, but they went there to study and to die. They were mainly Orthodox Jews. It had no political implications, and they relied on the Chalukah, that is the charity of richer Jews abroad. And in fact, Chaim Weizmann, who was the first president of the Israeli state, talked about the old Yishuv being the Jewish community in Palestine, to distinguish it from the new Yishuv, which was the Zionist community. So Jews never wanted to go there. In fact, when some 2.5 million Jews fled or emigrated from Tsarist Russia and Poland between the middle of the 19th century and the First World War, barely 1% of them went to Palestine. There was nothing stopping them. There were no immigration barriers. You didn't need a visa, but they didn't want to go to Palestine. They wanted to go to the New Jerusalem in the United States, as they saw it. And that has always been the case. And it's the case today. Most Jews living outside Israel don't want to go to Israel, and probably even more now than it was in the past. But because of time, apart from anything else, I do want to deal with the rise of the Nazis.
Yes, I mean,
and I think,
yeah. I mean, yeah, to my understanding, I think the Jews who were living in Palestine back then, like you said, Tony, they never had any political ideology.
and I'm going to quote, it's from a critical Zionist historian, Noah Lucas. sorry, I'm just going to find the quote now.
There's a lot to quote in your book, I can say that.
Yeah. Noah Lucas was a critical Zionist historian. He was a lecturer at Sheffield University. And he wrote in The Modern Foundations of Israel that as the European Holocaust erupted, Ben-Gurion, who was the chair of the Jewish Agency and then first prime minister, saw it as a decisive opportunity for Zionism. Ben-Gurion, above all others, sensed the tremendous possibilities inherent in the dynamic of the chaos and carnage in Europe. In conditions of peace, Zionism could not move the masses of world Jewry. The forces unleashed by Hitler, in all their horror, must be harnessed to the advantage of Zionism. By the end of 1942, the struggle for a Jewish state became the primary concern of the movement. And that was absolutely true. And Ben-Gurion, in essence, said the same. I recommend to people, if you want to know.
So that was the overwhelming reaction of Zionism to the rise of Nazis, Tony, like inside Germany, for example, or?
When the Nazis, when the Nazis arose, when Hitler took power in January 1933, the reaction of most Jews was aghast. It was horror. And they began immediately a Jewish boycott of anything German. And in March, the Jewish war veterans formally launched a boycott of Nazi Germany. But the Zionists reacted with absolute horror to this because they saw the rise of the Nazis. And I'm talking about the leadership of the Zionists, not their base. But the Zionist leadership, the Jewish Agency, David Ben-Gurion, saw it. And again, I mean, there are a few quotes I'll give to people, and they are only really just a few quotes. Well, Katznelson, who was really Ben-Gurion's deputy, a founder of Mapai, the Israeli Labour Party, an editor of its paper, Davar, he saw the rise of Hitler, quote, as an opportunity to build and flourish like none we have ever had or ever will. And that's in the book by Francis Nicosia, who's the Raoul Hilberg Professor of Holocaust Studies at Vermont University. He's written 2 books which are worth paying attention to. Ben-Gurion was even more optimistic. The Nazis' victory would become a fertile force for Zionism, which is what Lucas was saying. Joachim Prinz, who was a rabbi and a leader of the German Zionist movement before he was expelled, admitted that it was morally disturbing to seem to be considered as the favored children of the Nazi government, particularly when it dissolved the anti-Zionist youth groups and seemed in other ways to prefer the Zionists. The Nazis asked Jews for a more Zionist behavior. And again, you can read that. It was in The Young Zionist. And Eitan Bloom, who wrote a PhD thesis at Tel Aviv University in Arthur Rupin, quoted Emil Ludwig, the famous biographer who was also a Zionist, when he said, Hitler will be forgotten in a few years, but he will have a beautiful monument in Palestine. You know, the coming of the Nazis was rather a welcome thing. Thousands who seemed to be completely lost to Judaism were brought back to the fold by Hitler. And for that, I am personally very grateful to him. And Nachman Bialik, who is the national Zionist poet, everyone should know him who's a Zionist, volunteered that, quote, Hitlerism has perhaps saved German Jewry, which was being assimilated into annihilation. Germany's remaining Jews who didn't get out were, of course, assimilated, but it wasn't by annihilation. And the attitude of the Nazis was also really much the same.
So basically, assimilation is annihilation in the views of Zionism.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. There are many, many examples where Zionists have compared assimilation, marrying out, disappearing from the Jewish community, to the losses in the Holocaust. I give some examples again in my book where this takes place. on the 28th of January 1935, Reinhard Heydrich, people may know about Heydrich. He was the deputy to Himmler. He was in charge of the German police, and he was described by Gerald Rettlinger in his book, The Final Solution, as the real engineer of the final solution, which is true. He issued a directive stating that the activity of the Zionist-oriented youth organizations that were engaged in the occupational restructuring of the Jews lies in the interests of National Socialist state leadership. These organizations are not to be treated with that strictness that it is necessary to apply to the members of the so-called German Jewish organizations, brackets assimilationists. So the Nazis also hated assimilationists. And in May 1935, Schwarz Korps, which was the paper of the SS, wrote that the Zionists adhered to a strict racial position. And by emigrating to Palestine, they are helping to build their own Jewish state. The assimilation-minded Jews deny their race and insist on their loyalty to Germany or claim to be Christians because they have been baptized in order to subvert National Socialist principles. And this was a constant theme because on the 21st of June 1933, the Zionist Federation sent a memo to Hitler. It was never answered. You can read it in Lucy Davidowitz's Holocaust Reader. It read, Zionism has no illusions about the difficulty of the Jewish condition, which consists above all in an abnormal occupational pattern and in the fault of an intellectual and moral posture not rooted in one's own tradition. An answer to the Jewish question truly satisfying to the national state can be brought about only with the collaboration of the Jewish movement that aims at a social, cultural, and moral renewal of Jewry. On the foundations of the new state, which has established the principle of race, fruitful activity for the fatherland is possible. Our acknowledgement of Jewish nationality provides for a clear and sincere relationship to the German people, because of course, only the Zionists accepted that Jews were a separate nation and its national and racial realities. Precisely because we don't wish to falsify these fundamentals, because we too are against mixed marriages and are for maintaining the purity of the Jewish group, the realization of Zionism could only be hurt by resentment of Jews abroad against the German development. Boycott propaganda is in essence un-Zionist because Zionism wants not to do battle, but to convince. And of course, this was absolutely true. The Zionist movement fought tooth and nail against the boycott. And in August 1933, it negotiated and agreed a trading agreement called Havara with the Nazis. It resulted in the Nazis, in the Zionists, becoming what the leader of the American Jewish labor movement, whose name escapes me, described as a scab agent, because Palestine quickly filled up with German goods. And so they became the marketing agents for Nazi Germany's wares throughout the Middle East. They set up a separate company, a Near Middle East company, Nemco, as a result of this. So they undermined a boycott, which, if it had been allowed to progress, there was a very good chance that Hitler could have been overthrown in the winter of 1933. And the Nazis and the Zionists didn't want this because the rise of Hitler had been extremely beneficial to them. 60% of the capital investment in Jewish Palestine between 1933 and 1939 came from Nazi Germany. And so you could quite easily say it was Nazi Germany that helped build the Israeli state. Indeed, without the mass emigration occurred because of the rise of the Nazis, it's quite doubtful whether Israel as a Jewish state would ever have been created. So when I said in the speech that Israel was Hitler's bastard offspring and it produced a whale of criticism from the Jewish Chronicle and others in this country, I was only speaking the truth. And we now see that, you see, in Gaza. When Gallant started off the genocide, he called the Palestinians human animals. Well, if you go again to Lucy Davidovitz's Holocaust Reader, she was a right-wing Zionist. She's not an anti-Zionist. You will read of two speeches by Himmler on October the 4th and October the 6th at Posen or Poznan in Poland now, to senior SS generals on why it was right to carry out the extermination of the Jews. And in the course of it, he described the Jews as human animals, the exact same phrase that Gallant used. And it's interesting because Rabbi Eliyahu Maki, I think his name is, who is the leader, the main rabbi at Moshe Yeshiva in Jaffa, spoke about the need to eliminate Palestinian children because they will grow up to be terrorists. And this is exactly what Himmler said. He justified the murder of Jewish children because they will become the avengers of their fathers. And so you see the Zionist mindset, it almost works in parallel. And there are some Zionists today who accept that they are following in Hitler's footsteps as a result, because when they pursue a policy of starvation in northern Gaza, what are they doing? They're carrying out the policy that was enunciated by Hans Frank, the Nazi Governor General of Poland, death by hunger. And although the majority of the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto were murdered in the gas chambers of Treblinka, 83,000 died from hunger. So again, you see the parallels, and it's not hard to understand why. I mean, the reason is because Israel is an ethno-religious and ethno-nationalist Jewish religious state. It defines being Jewish on a national, on a racial, not on a religious basis, incidentally. The worst countries in Nazi-occupied Europe, the most anti-Semitic countries, were the Christian nationalist countries, which defined themselves ethnically as Christian. Slovakia, headed by a Catholic priest, Joseph Tiso, was the first to deport its Jews. It actually asked the Nazi Germany to take them off its hands, which they did. Or Romania, where the League of the Archangel Gabriel, the Legionnaires, conducted a pogrom in Bucharest, during which they slaughtered Jews and hung them from butchers' hooks in meat shops. I mean, anti-Semitism was of the feudal kind there. Or Croatia, which was the only country under Nazi occupation to establish its own extermination camp, Jasenovac, headed by Catholic priests. Although the majority of people exterminated were actually Serbs, not Jews, but and Muslims also. But the religious, ethnic, ethno-nationalist states are always the most racist, because if you're not Jewish in a Jewish state, you have to be an outsider. It's inherent in the very nature and makeup of that state that you can't be equal, which is why the nonsense of the Zionist slogan, a Jewish democratic state, it's just an oxymoron. It's a complete contradiction. So that is what Israel is today. But I'll finish with this point. I don't know whether there are any Zionists here, but when Hitler came to power in 1933, he had played down anti-Semitism between 1930 and 33 to the point of non-existence, because anti-Semitism in Germany was not particularly respectable by then. And the Nazis had to work very hard to engender an anti-Semitic consciousness. By way of contrast, the level of racism in Israel is off the scale. And that is the state, that the Jewish state that has been created, where slogans like "finish them off," "death to the Arabs," etc., are so widespread it's barely worth commenting on. So I don't know how much time I've taken, but I've taken far too much. So I'll finish there.
It's been great. Thank you so much, Tony, for elaborating that much. I just want to ask a couple of questions before I open it to the Q&A, if I may. I wanted to ask a question into the details of your book. There's this affair that is called the Ketzner's affair. The Ketzner affair, where two of the German Jews escape Auschwitz concentration camp and managed to leave and get out and warn the Jewish community that, you know, something is an extermination campaign is happening. However, it was kind of obfuscated for certain reasons. Could you elaborate a little bit on that story?
Yeah, okay, briefly, because it is quite a story in its own right. They were Slovakian, not German Jews, incidentally. They escaped on 10th of April 1944 and reached Slovakia on the 24th of April. The context of this was that Hungary contained the last major Jewish community of about 800,000, which the Nazis hadn't touched because the Nazis never occupied Hungary. On the 19th of March, they did occupy Hungary for reasons I won't go into. And the final solution began with the deportations on the 15th of May. Up to then, Auschwitz had been considered a labor camp, not an extermination camp. And they came out with the information, they wrote it down. It was called either the Verba Wetzler Protocol or the Auschwitz Protocols. And they handed it was handed by the Jewish Council, the Judenrat in Slovakia, to Rudolf Kastner, who was the leader of Hungarian Zionism, who came to Bratislava once a month to meet fellow Jewish communities leaders. Kastner was in negotiations with Eichmann to secure a train out of Hungary for the Zionist and the Jewish elite, a train which was eventually 1,684 people. In return, he kept quiet about the destination of deportation trains. He suppressed the Auschwitz protocols and indeed misinformed Jews that they were going to a fictitious resettlement camp, Kenya Mage, rather than, of course, Auschwitz. The result is that when some of the survivors of those deportations, because it was very late in the day, and so it was more likely there were survivors than if they'd been deported 2 years previously, came back and settled in Israel, they were full of accusations that Kastner was a collaborator, which he was. Kastner was a senior government official. He was supposed to be a Mapai member of the Knesset for the next Knesset. He sued at the state's instigation for libel because they called him a collaborator. The trial took, for him, a rather unfortunate turn because he became, in essence, a defendant, the accused. And it turned out that most of the accusations, and I think something like 18 Holocaust survivors from Auschwitz testified against Kastner and his aides, his Zionist aides, in Kolosvar, Cluj, which was his hometown, about the fact that they misinformed people about where they were going. They hadn't just suppressed the protocols, they'd actually misinformed people. And the Zionist movement as a whole did. There was virtually nothing in the Palestine press about Hungary, about the exterminations. It was only when the Swiss press blew it at the end of June, 300 articles appeared almost simultaneously, that massive pressure was put on Horthy. The Admiral Horthy was the leader of the Hungarian government to put a halt to the deportations. Because of that, Budapest's 200,000 Jews were saved, but 437,000 had already been deported to Auschwitz or to Germany as labor. I'm not quite sure the figures. I don't think anyone is, but nearly 500,000 Jews had been deported. In fact, Kastner was trying to arrange a second train for Budapest Jews in the event that the rest of them were exterminated. But by that time, he was an isolated figure. Others had taken over, and the Nazis weren't able to impose their will. And Auschwitz itself was closing down at the end of October. So it actually wasn't possible, as the Russians surrounded Hungary, to effect the deportations. Although the Nazi government, as a Hungarian Nazi government, the Arrow Cross was in charge, and they killed probably 50,000 of the 250,000 Budapest Jews. But nonetheless, the large majority survived. And that was what the Kastner affair is. It lasted for 4 years in Israel, although the Supreme Court acquitted him by 4-1. The trial judge, in a very detailed 300-page judgment, said he had sold his soul to Satan. And he was defended by Chaim Cohen, who was the Attorney General. It's worth probably quoting him because it says quite a lot. Yes, Cohen's appeal to the Supreme Court on the 20th of January 1957, he said, and it's on page 213 of my book, he said, if in Kastner's opinion, rightly or wrongly, he believed that 1 million Jews were hopelessly doomed, he was allowed not to inform them of their fate and to concentrate on the saving of the few. He was entitled to make a deal with the Nazis for the saving of a few hundred and entitled not to warn the millions. In fact, if that's how he saw it, rightly or wrongly, that was his duty. It has always been our Zionist tradition to select the few out of the many in arranging immigration to Palestine. Are we therefore to be called traitors? And I think the answer is yes. Eichmann, he went on, Eichmann, the chief exterminator, knew that the Jews would be peaceful and not resist if he allowed the prominents, that is the leaders, to be saved. That the train of the prominents was organized on Eichmann's orders to facilitate the extermination of the whole people. If all the Jews of Hungary are to be sent to their death, he is entitled to organize a rescue train for 600 people. He is not only entitled to it, but is also bound to act accordingly. That verdict, he was acquitted by the Supreme Court by 4-1, although one of the four also disagreed with those arguments, but acquitted him on legal grounds. It later turned out that Kastner had gone to Nuremberg and testified in favor of some of the leading Nazi butchers, with Viceni, Krumi, who was a deputy to Eichmann, and Kurt Becher. So there's no doubt he was a collaborator, but he was a representative of the Jewish agency. He wasn't acting on his own. And the Zionist record in the Holocaust is an abysmal one, to be quite honest. So I mean, throughout the Holocaust, the Zionists opposed any rescue to any place other than Palestine. They actually blocked rescue and openly did so as well. There's really no doubt about it.
It's unbelievable, and your book has a wealth of examples and details on how that was happening. I mean, they were preventing Jews to be rescued out of concentration camps into the UK, into the US. Only migration to Palestine was permitted, and so on and so forth. But Tony, I wanted to, like, we talked about anti-Semitism in Europe. And but before I ask the question, by the way, I really encourage everyone to just put in the questions in their Q&A boxes. There was a rife anti-Semitism in Europe, and we talked about the persecution of the Jews in Europe. I mean, how was the sentiment in the Arab region, in the Ottoman Empire? I mean, given that incident that you just mentioned about the Hajj Amin Husseini and his interaction with the Nazis, was there any anti-Semitism against the Jews in the Arab world?
Well, the Mufti of Jerusalem was appointed by the British, despite coming fourth in the election. So he was never elected by a Palestinian. He was certainly a reactionary, but I wouldn't call it anti-Semitism in the Arab world. It was kind of functional. It was opposition to the Jewish colonization. It's like when Arabs today talk about Yahud, they're talking about people who come to them as Jews. So that's how they respond. It's not the racial anti-Semitism of Europe, and it's a mistake to call it such. On the contrary, I mean, all the Arab countries before the Zionist state got going had large Jewish populations, and it's another story about how the Zionists destabilized those countries to provide a working class for Israel, in particular the Iraqi and the Moroccan Jewish communities. But let's just leave it at there. I'm not an expert at anti-Semitism in the Arab countries. There was some. I'm not suggesting not, but the Holocaust happened in Europe. It didn't happen in the Arab countries.
Absolutely. So there's a few questions here, which is great. When did Zionism break with Nazism is a question. I think it's lacking some more details to it. Did you want to have a go at answering this question, Tony?
Well, Zionism in an imperialist sense broke with the Nazis in 1939 because the Zionist movement was allied to British imperialism. If British imperialism was fighting Nazi Germany, then it's quite unlikely that the Zionist movement would have supported Hitler. I say that, I mean, the Zionist movement was never allied to Nazi Germany, but it sought to take advantage of the rise of the Nazis, and it acted accordingly. I mean, it was the only group amongst Jews who welcomed the Nuremberg race laws of 1935. But I would never say they had a formal alliance. I think that would be going much too far. They simply saw their opportunity, and they undermined any possibility of a coordinated opposition by Jews and others internationally.
There's a question that was also on my mind here. Why do Peter Dutton, that's the opposition leader here in Australia, Donald Trump, Narendra Modi, Bolsonaro, and other racist leaders in the world, why do they all love Israel?
Well, anti-Semites have always loved Israel, because if you're an anti-Semite, then what better place to send them than Israel? It's historically that's always been the case. The people who have supported Zionism have historically been anti-Semitic. I mean, you can go through them. The leaders of the British fascists, the British Brothers League, were all professed Zionists. Today, Trump, Bannon, Gawker, all of them, they're the right-wing Republicans. I mean, the only form of anti-racism they subscribe to is what they call anti-Semitism, which they define as support for Israel. So it's quite understandable that the right wing supports Israel and Zionism because it's a colonialist, imperialist philosophy and idea.
And you mentioned plenty of examples in your book at the last part as well. Another question, Tony, I have someone, Vandana is saying, I have Jewish friends who say that they are anti-Zionists. Does that mean that they are against the right of Israel to exist?
I can't speak for them, but I can only speak for myself. I am opposed to the right of any racial supremacist state to exist, of course. I'm opposed, or I was opposed, to the existence of the South African apartheid state. I would hope people were opposed to the existence of an Aryan supremacist state. So, yes, I'm opposed to the right of Israel to exist as a Jewish supremacist state. I support a single democratic secular state in Palestine.
I totally agree. It's that supremacist part that is problematic. It's that Zionism that is really the issue when it comes to Israel. Another question from Michael says, given many parallels between Nazism and Zionism, is it appropriate to coin and use the term Zionazism? Possibly, Michael. That's an interesting term.
I think there are differences between Zionism and Nazism. Zionism is a settler colonial movement. Nazism was a fascist movement, although there are things in common. I mean, there are certainly comparisons to be made. So whether it's correct to say Zio-Nazi, I'm not sure, because most Zionists in diaspora wouldn't see themselves as Nazis, but I mean, certainly some are Jewish Nazis. So you have to make your own decision on that.
Absolutely. It's the racism that is shared between the two ideologies, I would say. A question here from Wendy, Tony. Zionists justify their land grab by saying there has always been a Jewish presence in Palestine going back to King David 2000 BCE. Is that right?
Well, there may well have been a Jewish presence in Palestine, but it didn't have any political implications. Jews in Palestine who lived there for a long time never thought to assert the need for a Jewish state. They didn't see any reason why. They were interested in living with their Arab, Muslim, Christian friends on an equal basis. So the fact that there may have been Jews there is completely irrelevant. And as I already explained, the Jews who did live there were the ones who were opposed to the Zionists because they saw them as colonialists.
Absolutely. They didn't have that political conviction that, you know, the colonial ideology of Zionism. It was more of a kind of yearning to the homeland, being in Palestine. So the next question from Andrew, Tony, are all Orthodox Jews necessarily also Zionists? Is it part of their core belief systems and practice?
No, there are anti-Zionist Jews. There are religious Orthodox Jews who are anti-Zionist. Netanyahu Carter are one. But I would say today the majority of Orthodox Jews are Zionists because Zionism has fundamentally transformed in many ways the Jewish religion. It hasn't stayed still. Whereas historically, Orthodox Judaism opposed Zionism. They set up their own organization called Agudat Yisrael. Today, Agudat Yisrael is in the Israeli Knesset, although formally it's not Zionist, but it's only formally, in practice it is. So the answer is no, not all Orthodox Jews, but a majority are, I'm afraid.
Yes, and that anti-Zionist Orthodox Jews group, I've been listening to a podcast by Yaakov Shapiro, Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, and he's brilliant into drawing that distinction and, you know, pretty much putting forward what Zionism is actually in relation to Judaism, which are absolutely very, very different and not related at all. So my second question from Wendy as well, can there be a Jewish state that is not Zionist, that is truly love your neighbor Jewish?
No, because there's a tendency once you marry religion with the state that you produce racism. Because if it's a Jewish state, what does that mean? Unless it's theoretically possible to have a state which is simply a cultural center for Jews but has no political implications in terms of the rights of people. For example, Britain today is formally a Christian country. The Queen is head of the Church of England. But my rights as someone Jewish are no different from someone who's not Jewish. People don't tell me I can't rent certain places because I'm Jewish. But in Israel, 93% of the land is Jewish land. It's Jewish state land or owned by the Jewish National Fund. And therefore it's off limits to anyone who's not Jewish. So you could have, in theory, a Jewish state, but today, practically, that would not be possible.
My next question, Tony, is from Peter. Torah Judaism opposes Zionism. Can you expand a little bit on this statement, if you can?
Sorry, what he's saying that the
Torah opposes Zionism.
Well, the Torah was written probably a couple of thousand years ago, when the idea of Zionism hadn't even occurred. So, I mean, the Torah was written in a completely different era. So Zionism really didn't arise. I mean, there were what were called Jewish states, Israel and Judah, but they ended up fighting each other around, I don't know, 600-700 BCE. But they were really just city-states at best. I mean, they weren't states that we know now. But no, I don't think there's any comparison at all, really, today. The Torah, I say, belongs to a different era, a feudal pre-capitalist era. So, in practice, the Talmud, which is the rabbinical interpretation of the Torah, takes precedence now. So it's not the word of the Torah. On the contrary, it's in many ways it's subverted by later rabbinical interpretations.
I totally agree. I think to my understanding, Zionism has hijacked the Judaism or used misinterpretations from the Bible and Torah to kind of promote their, political ideology in seizing the land in Palestine. Another question, can the Jewish religion or Israelis in general, let's say, recover from the damage of Zionism?
It's a good one. The simple answer is I don't know, because Jews themselves have changed fundamentally, maybe in the last 50 or 60 years, whereas Jews in England were seen as being on the left, socialists, communists, trade unionists. They've risen socio-economically, and so have moved to the right politically. So when you're talking about Jews today, you're talking about a very different creature from the Jews who inhabited the Jewish East End of London, which was a working class area where they were going on strike and so on. So Jewish identity has changed through the ages. Identities are not fixed. They change as the people themselves have changed. And so the idea you can go back to what was, I think, is quite illusory in many ways. And the same would be true for Palestinians as well. Palestinian society has moved on, and Palestinians won't be able to recreate the illusions of the past, as it were. Although many will not realize that now, they too have changed. They've become a diaspora people in many ways. So I don't think you can really rescue the religion, which has been thoroughly Zionized. If Israel disappeared, then it's possible, but I think it would die out, to be quite honest.
I mean, Tony, you mentioned that the anti-Semitism was rife in Europe, and the Zionists were convinced that, anti-Semitism is kind of ingrained in the DNA of Europeans back then, and it doesn't have a solution, and the only way to combat it is to leave, to abandon ship, really, because this was the only option. Do you see any rationale in that logic?
Well, that was the reaction of Zionism. I mean, it wasn't unique. There are many separatist organizations or groups. Marcus Garvey, for example, took on the views of white supremacists who said blacks didn't belong, and he said, yes, that's true. And he was infamous for working with the KKK against other black people. So this is not new. Organizations of the oppressed sometimes take on the ideas of their oppressor and invert them. And that's what Zionism did. Of course, today it is a different matter because most American Jews, which is the second largest community of Jews, are integrated and assimilated. And so you are seeing actually the development of quite large numbers of anti-Zionist Jews there as well. So I think just watch this space, really. I don't want to make any predictions for what may happen in the future.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, everyone is hungry for predictions. I mean, I'm looking at the questions here. It's just what's going to happen. But I do have an interesting question here, Tony. What do you think about the arrest warrants? Will anything come out of it? Are you optimistic or pessimistic? Will Zionists finish the job, as they say? It's a lot of questions in there.
Well, I think it's very important politically that arrest warrants have been issued for the Israeli war criminals. Do I think they will be implemented? No, I don't. I mean, I think what's happened is, if you like, the collapse of the so-called rules-based order. And America has made it very clear but it has absolute contempt for any court that might hold them to account. So the Americans have passed this act known as the Hague Invasion Act, basically that any American who's captured and taken to the Hague will be rescued by the American military forces. And Donald Trump was one of those who introduced it. So you're seeing a disjuncture, if you like, between the ideology of the West, which is based on international law, and the complete collapse of international law. I mean, it's only very reluctantly the ICC issued the warrant. They did it after 3 days, I think, with Putin, whereas it's taken them the best part of a year. So I think politically it's important, symbolically, to be able to cast Netanyahu and his fellows as war criminals. But I don't actually see Netanyahu ending up at The Hague anytime soon.
Yes, I mean, it's an important step, but yeah, I mean, it's not going to stop the genocide. It's not going to cease fire anytime soon, but yes, in the long run, it might be an important step. I think I'm gonna take a couple of more questions, Tony. You mentioned Moroccan Jewish connection. Do you think that the convenience of this historic relationship will continue?
Well, I'm not quite sure which historical association has been talked about.
It was referring to the Jewish Moroccan community, I think, in Morocco, and their relation right now, I think, in terms of facilitating the ships going into Israel.
Well, I mean, in Morocco, the state of Morocco, which of course is a pretty repressive state, and the state which colonizes Western Sahara, most Jews left for Israel. And there were various things that happened in their community prior to that, bombs being thrown and so on. There is a Jewish community in Morocco. I don't think it's very big. And Morocco said that Jews who left could go back. And obviously there are thousands of Moroccan Jews in Israel who form a subcomponent of what's called the Mizrahi community. But I don't see any major developments on that front.
One more question. Can you tell us about Keir Starmer's government, in particular the Zionist influence over it and the mass movement for justice in Palestine outside it?
Well, Keir Starmer is on record as saying that this was an interview, I think, with the Times of Israel, he's a Zionist without qualification. So the Labour government here, which is really no different from the Tory government that preceded it, is ardently pro-Zionist and pro-Israel. I think it would be a mistake to see it as having been captured by the Zionist lobby, Israel, or so on. The West adopted Zionism well before Jews. The British state has adopted Zionism for over a century. It was their settled policy. The United States was slower coming round, but it did come round in the end, and Israel became its favored partner in the Middle East. So most Western governments support the Israeli state because they support the Western presence in the Middle East, a vital area strategically in terms of the route to Africa and Asia, and of course for the oil. And that is at the root of the matter. And Israel is seen as the West's guard dog over radical Arab nationalist regimes and movements that may take place. So really, Israel's battle with Iran, for instance, is a battle for supremacy in the region, nothing more. It's not to do with nuclear weapons. I mean, that's the pretext. But we know that when the nuclear agreement was signed, Israel was opposed to it. Israel wants supremacy. And Starmer is no different from his predecessors in supporting the supremacy of the Israeli state. In Britain itself, a large Palestine solidarity movement has grown up. And the question here, and no doubt in Australia and elsewhere, is how you combat, if you like, one's own government in terms of its support for Zionism, because that's the case virtually everywhere in the world, especially the Western world, that Western governments support Israel, right or wrong. They don't see the genocide, it's invisible to them. They talk about October the 7th as if it came out of the blue and nothing had gone before. So this is to be expected. This is imperialist politics at their best or worst.
I mean, I always had this question in my head before we go, Tony. So we always hear that Israel is an outpost for imperialist powers just to maintain a leg in the region, for example, for the US and their European allies and so on and so forth. I mean, at the beginning, probably I would agree with that, but now, I mean, seeing the behavior of Israel ever expanding into southern Lebanon, into parts of Syria, I mean, it sounds like it's actually expanding. It tries to expand its territories beyond historic borders of Palestine. So is that part of the plan as well by the imperialist powers as well, to allow Israel to actually do whatever it wants within the region? Rewrite boundaries?
No, I don't think it's part of the imperialist plan, but that doesn't mean imperialism won't go along with it. I mean, it wasn't part of the imperialist plan that Israel took over the West Bank in 1967 and the Gaza Strip, but it did, and the West's come round to it. Zionism never sought to conquer. Its original plan was not ancient Palestine. Its original plan was Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, the biblical land of Israel. And that, it depends on who you talk to. That can stretch up to the Litani, across to the Euphrates, and down to the Nile. So there's plenty of potential for expansion. I would think that if Israel annexes the West Bank and it succeeds in expelling the Palestinians over the Jordan, the next target will be the East Bank of Jordan. So Zionism tends to destabilize, and Israel does, everything around it. Settler colonialism is inherently expansionist. So there is no limit in a sense, except the number of Jewish settlers they can mobilize. We shall see. Maybe they will recruit more Jews or convert more non-Jews to Jews by relaxing the conversion criteria. I don't know. I suspect that Zionism will face its own problems internally as well, because I think the Israeli state is inherently unstable. It's glued together between two different components of the Israeli Jewish population, those who believe they're Jewish first and those who believe they're Israeli first. So there are all sorts of contradictions, and it would be a brave person who makes predictions in the current climate.
On that note, Tony, I mean, it's a very dynamic situation. I mean, maybe in a couple of hours, something major will happen and it'll change the whole conversation. I really want to thank you for joining me today. There's a couple of announcements I want to make before I end. The video recording of this session will be sent out to everyone who's registered, and I'll also send it out to my mailing list, which is quite larger, and we'll put it out on our YouTube channel and for the YouTube channel of Free Palestine Melbourne as well. The audio also will be made available on podcast, and at some point next month will be played on the local community radios as well. Such a fascinating conversation, and an eye-opener. And I also want to encourage everyone to go on TonyGreenstein.com website and have a look at the blog itself that he has. And also, I really encourage everyone to buy the book, because there's lots of details, lots of examples, just to show the true ugly face of Zionism and how it actually abused the religion of Judaism in doing what it's perpetrating now in Gaza, genocide and campaigns and ethnic cleansing. And it's also available on, if you're boycotting Amazon, then contact Tony Greenstein directly. But if you're not, it's also available on Amazon. Finally, yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Can you send me those links to the when the talk is up, or so I can download it myself?
Definitely, I will. I also want to let everyone know that this session was free, but people donated voluntarily, and I really want to thank everyone who donated generously. As I mentioned in previous webinars, I'm in touch with a family that is looking after the families who were ethnically cleansed from their homes in northern Gaza, and she's also looking after the orphans who lost their parents and siblings. And all the money is going to that lady or that family. Also in touch with a few families here in Gaza who are in Sydney, who are refugees from Gaza. So all the money will go to those families. Again, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. I want to thank Tony very much. Thank you for waking up this early for us, and I hope you'll enjoy your morning or rest of the day. And have a great evening and night, everyone who joined us.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tony.